At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. So today, I'm going to share with you a question that keeps me up at night. And the question itself is pretty simple, and I'm going to give you the answer. But then after that, I'm going to tell you why this question bothers me so, why it keeps me going. Even after I have this answer, I still ask this to myself every night. And here's the question. Why did Jesus die on the cross? Now, it sounds simple, but do you know the answer? Why did Jesus die on the cross? So I'm going to give you the answer right now, and I'm going to walk you through, because we need to understand what happened in the Old Testament and all of the events leading up to Jesus' death to give us that answer. So here we go. First off, we need to understand why we were created. We were created to be in loving relationship with God. Have you ever wondered, why doesn't Jesus just zoom us all to heaven? Why do we have to be here at all? Why didn't Jesus just start us in heaven? And maybe you've heard the answer. If you haven't, here it is. The answer is, you can't love someone unless you have a choice. So you can't be in loving relationship with God if you never had the choice. So Adam and Eve were given the choice. Do they love God, and do they obey God? Do they choose to be in this proper relationship with God, this loving relationship with God, or do they choose to go their own way? And we know the answer to that. Right away, they chose to go their own way. And we actually don't know how long before they chose. It doesn't really matter. They chose to do their own thing. They chose to break their promise. They chose to break their promise to God. And in so doing, they broke the relationship. They separated themselves from the presence of God. They separated themselves from God. Right away, what happens? They get removed from the garden. The garden represents the presence of God. That's where they walked and talked with God. So they were removed from the garden. So they were removed from the presence, and then something needed to change. Right? So what we see after that is what happens when we're not in relationship with God. What happens when we're not experiencing the life God had for us? We see people doing their own thing. We see lots of sin. That's why you have Noah's Ark. Noah's Ark happened because so many people were sinful and doing such horrible things that God needed to kind of hit the reset button. So then, after Noah, what do we get? We get Abraham, and God chooses a people to represent him, to try and bring the light to the world. But then even that is not quite enough, and we need a place to go to be with God. So then we have the temple. The temple represents the place that we go to be with God. And what do we have along with the temple? We have a sacrificial system. And why did we need that? We needed a sacrificial system to help cleanse us from our sins, because sin separates us from God. Sin separates us from God, so we needed to be purified so that we could be close to God. So God gave us a sacrificial system. We take an innocent, flawless animal and sacrifice them, and they represent, because they were without sin, they were without flaw, they take our sins away from us. They stand in our place. They take the place of us. They take our guilt from us. It would take a whole series to talk about why that is the case. But all that to say, the sacrificial system stood in place. But the temple, you need to understand the way the temple is structured too, because the temple had these different courts. And the inner court, the Holy of Holies, is where God's presence was. God's presence was there, unfettered, unblocked, unveiled in the court, and it was separated from the outer courts by a thick curtain. And once a year, the priest would have to go through this whole purification system and go into the Holy of Holies to atone for Israel's sins. No one else was allowed in there, and the priests had to go through all these purification ceremonies because if they had any sin when they went in, they would die, because to be in God's presence, directly in God's presence with sin, was to die. So we had a sacrificial system just so we could approach God's presence. But we couldn't be directly in God's presence because we still had sin. The sacrificial system didn't make us pure as if we never sinned. It just atoned for it so we could approach God. But we needed something more. And that's why Jesus came on the scene. Jesus came on the scene to fix the problem of us being separated from God. So remember, though, the temple was where people could approach God's presence. And in order to understand what Jesus did, you need to see Jesus right before he dies on the cross. He goes into the temple, and you probably heard about this. He starts overturning. He goes into a rage. He goes full rage, overturns tables, gets super upset at everyone. Why was that? It was because the temple is where you were allowed to approach God's presence. It represented the presence of God. It's where everyone could go to get close to God. But they had polluted that. They had warped that. They had corrupted it. And Jesus was upset by this because, remember, we were created to be in loving relationship with God. And at best, they had a flawed relationship with God, but they still had a relationship with God. But the Pharisees and all of the people working in the temple had ruined that by turning it into a marketplace. So then keep in mind now, what do we know so far? We were created to be in loving relationship with God. Sin, and the original sin especially, but sin separates us from God. So then the temple and the sacrificial system is a stand-in. It's supposed to help purify us so that we can approach God's presence. But even still, there's a curtain separating us from the place where God's presence ultimately is. So now Jesus dies on the cross. And we heard this. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. So the curtain that separated us from the presence of God was torn in two. Why was it torn in two? Because Jesus became the ultimate sacrifice. Before we sacrificed animals, but that wasn't enough. We needed something greater. Jesus became the greatest sacrifice that purified us from our sins so that we could go into the Holy of Holies to be with God. But the reason we had the Holy of Holies is because if God's presence were just everywhere, people would just be dying because of sin. But now because Jesus purified us, we no longer need to go to a place to approach God. God's presence is everywhere. We can now approach God wherever we want. God is with us now. All we need to do to be in God's presence is to ask, is to choose to enter God's presence, to worship, is to just say, God, I want to be with you right now. We now have access to God's presence where we didn't before. We can approach God without worrying about being struck dead because Jesus' blood covers our sins. Jesus' blood makes us righteous. Even when we sin, Jesus' blood immediately covers it and we can be with God. We never have to worry about going to God. In fact, when you sin, that's the time you should go to God most because you need Him to help you fix that behavior, to help you correct that mistake, to help you get back on track. So, the easy answer to this is Jesus died on the cross so that we could re-enter a loving relationship with God, so that we could enter the presence of God. Jesus died on the cross to fix our relationship with God. Paul says it this way, Jesus reconciled us to God. Jesus fixed the relationship. But here's the deal. First off, I should say, take advantage of that. Take advantage of the fact that we have access to the presence of God all the time. There's no reason why every day you can't be with God. You can't experience His presence. You don't need to go to church, and there doesn't need to be a worship band or a pastor to help you get close to God. You can do that on your own at home, and you should do that regularly. But here we go. Here, I'm going to leave you with this question. Why does this question still keep me up at night? If I know the answer to why Jesus died on the cross, why does this still keep me up at night? Here's the deal. God created everything. God created the universe. God also created logic. God created all math and sciences. So God created things both physical and thought. And God also created the sacrificial system. Basically, what I'm saying here is because God created everything, that means that God also chose the sacrificial system as the way that our sins are forgiven. God made sacrifice necessary for our forgiveness, which means that God chose His own death to forgive us of our sins. So why? Why did God choose this? Why did Jesus have to die on the cross? And I think there's a good reason. I don't think this is a way of saying, well, this doesn't make sense. God had a very good reason for that. But here's the deal. I don't know. I don't know why God chose that as the method for forgiveness. Why God chose that as the way that we are redeemed and our friendship with God is reconciled and we can now be in loving relationship with God. So I want to leave this with you. I'm curious your thoughts. So go ahead and write in the comments. I want to know why you think God chose this as the way for our forgiveness. Why did God build this into creation from the very beginning? Why did God make this the way in which our sins are forgiven? Why is this the way that our sins, the chains that hold us, the sin that holds us back, that we're slave to, is broken, is through this sacrifice? All right, I'm excited to hear your comments. Go ahead and right now comment below your thoughts, and I will respond as soon as I can. I'm excited to see your comments, and I'm excited to see you all when I see you. All right, peace out.